Welcome back to class, everybody. Hold on, let me try to move that bar a little bit. I'm going to need it again in a minute. All right. For a quick second, I'll blow my face up there for you. So the notes that we're starting here today, I'm throwing two different sections of notes at you. I don't know if you're watching this one first or the other, but right now we should have 3 ongoing pages of notes. So you should have progressive era notes that we were working on last week. Keep those. We're going to add more to them in the near future. You would have like the America becomes a world power notes. That's going to be like foreign policy stuff. This chunk, the annexation of Hawaii, should go in those. And then the other segment that I'm have going on today is like the Teddy Roosevelt kind of life story, his biography. So those would be the 3 pages of notes that we're working on. On all of them, I promise it's not going to be like pages and pages and pages for each one. Probably for each one of those, it would be, if you're doing a really good job and including all the info you need, maybe about a page front and back to 2 pages. And I don't want to get you confused with too many ongoing pages, but we did do Industrial Revolution notes too. Those ones, don't throw them away yet. I mean, we're done with them as far as quizzes and assignments, but there will be exam questions that would come off of that stuff. So always, I'd say for all of these notes we're doing, if you're doing a good job and doing the hard work of taking notes in my class, which I think is a really important part of like really any history or social studies class, don't go throw them away as soon as we take the quiz. You always, for my class, you keep them until the end of the marking period. And then starting marking period 2, then you can junk them and it'll be all new material. But for mine, you're going to hold on to that stuff until the exam, the quarter 1 exam. At that point, then everything you have from quarter 1, all the old notes, you can throw those out and you'll be able to start fresh with the new material we're covering for quarter 2. Okay, so America becoming a world power, like the frontier had closed. There's no more Wild West. The whole cowboys and Indians and all of that stuff has kind of wrapped up. And really from coast to coast, from Atlantic to Pacific, America has we have rail lines. It's been, I don't want to say civilized. That's the wrong way of saying it, but it's been starting to be industrialized. And, these areas that were territories are now being incorporated into states. So America increasingly, right around 1900, and this event with Hawaii actually happens in 1898, we start to look abroad. We start to flex our muscles, and we want to become a powerful nation, just like the most powerful countries in the world at the time, the British, the French, Russia, all of these big European nations that had built up massive empires. So we don't really want to feel left out with that. We want to feel like we're just as tough as any of them. All right, now the story of Hawaii is going to be, I think, kind of an interesting one. If you ever wondered, how the heck did we get some little chain of 7 Pacific islands incorporated into the United States and now it eventually becomes a state? What's the story behind that? How'd that happen? Here you go. I'm going to give it to you in a nutshell. And today, a couple different slides we're going to go through, but really, this is the only slide where you're actually going to have to do any like writing for it. So first up, annexation of Hawaii. If you've never heard the term annexation before, that's a good one that I would recommend you put that into your notes. And to annex means, it basically, very simple term, it means like to make a part of. It's like a fancier way of saying we're taking it, we're adding it on to us. So annexing Hawaii, it's like we're adding it into the United States. Now the backstory to this. So Pearl Harbor, which most of you have probably at least heard that term before. It's a naval base out in the Pacific. Today, it's still basically the central hub, the base of Pacific operations for the U.S. Navy. Well, we have been using Pearl Harbor for a really, really long time. It's most famous for the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and that's what pulls us into World War II. So we'll be coming back to that kind of in like marking period 3 when we get to that point in history. But way before World War II, we had been using Pearl Harbor. Now, what is a harbor? A harbor is essentially like it's a natural geographical phenomenon where you have like the land, the coastline wraps around and kind of makes a protective shell over a body of water. The reason harbors are so important is, think, if you just went out to Hawaii or out on the coast in California, you could build big docks out into the ocean and have these big battleships and cruisers come up and, get their supplies and get men on and off and refuel. You could do that on any place in the coast. But the problem is, once in a great while, there's going to be a big storm, or there's going to be an earthquake way over in Japan, and that'll create a tsunami, one of those massive waves that comes across the Pacific Ocean. And if and when that happens, which it does happen kind of semi-regularly, if you just had your ships, these big, heavy ships that are hundreds of tons out there on the coastline, those massive waves would wash that ship up on the shore. And once it gets up there, you ain't getting it off. Those ships are way too heavy to go get a tugboat out there and pull them back out into the ocean. So those ships are massive. They need fairly deep water in order to, come up and dock. So a harbor works out perfectly, because when you do have a massive storm or a tsunami coming across the ocean, the coastline is going to get ravaged. It's just out on the ocean. But anything inside a naturally occurring harbor, just like Pearl Harbor is, the coastline, the actual island, will absorb that wave, and then the waters inside the harbor stay relatively calm. So Pearl Harbor at Hawaii was a perfect place for this. And we had been leasing it from the King of Hawaii for many, many years. I'm not sure exactly when that started, but for a generation at this point, that had been one of our main naval bases out there. Now, Hawaii at this point was not part of the United States. It wasn't a U.S. territory. We didn't control it at all. We just had a naval base out there. And we paid the King of Hawaii, because Hawaii was its own separate independent country. It was an autonomous nation at that time, a small kingdom. We paid the king quite a bit of money so that we could use our ships there and go in and out. And we had a pretty good working relationship with them. Now, the King of Hawaii ended up passing away. And that's where this story really kind of gets going. His daughter becomes the new queen. She takes over after he died. Okay, it's a monarchy. For whatever reason, and I don't really know the whole backstory to this, she didn't like having the Americans on her island. She felt like essentially that we were like corrupting Hawaiian culture, because increasingly over her lifetime, really even probably a little bit before she was born, more and more Americans had been moving out to Hawaii. It's a tropical paradise. It's awesome. So on the one hand, you have this big naval base there and an American military presence, which is kind of sending the rest of the world the message that this is our turf, don't mess with it. And then piggybacking off of that, you had a lot of farmers moving out there that were going and growing crops and stuff. They were growing tropical fruits, pineapples, bananas, that kind of stuff that they could can up and ship back to the States and make money. Well, she didn't like that. That really bugged her, and she felt like they were losing their traditions and culture, and that these white guys, these Americans, these Europeans keep coming over here in greater and greater numbers, and we're kind of losing our identity. So I get that point. I get where she's coming from. What she decided to do once she was the ruler of the islands was she wanted to break the lease with the U.S. Navy. And then because of that, the U.S. was not happy about that, but we weren't going to go to war over it. We were like, man, that's a bummer, but we'll find another naval base somewhere else out in the Pacific where we can refuel our ships. But the farmers that had moved out there, they freak out, because they're like, man, if they kick the U.S. Navy out of here, who's next? And some of these guys had been making a lot of money growing pineapples and growing these tropical fruits. So they freak out, and they're like, man, we've invested this. This is our livelihood. We've put everything into these fruit farms out here. And what if the queen just on a whim decides she's going to boot us out of here? So the pineapple farmers, led by this guy, Sanford Dole, I'll show you a picture of him in a minute. If you've ever heard of Dole Fruit, had a little Dole Fruit cup, well, he was the guy that founded that company. He is the richest of all of these farmers. He becomes kind of the ringleader, and he talks to the other farmers on the island, and they pool their money and resources, and they actually send some letters and make some contacts back to the States, and they find guys that were retired U.S. Marines. So these guys that are pretty tough dudes, they know their way around a fight, they know how to use weapons, and they hire in a bunch of mercenaries. That's a good term for you too. A mercenary is a soldier for hire. So these guys that they recruit out there were not active duty U.S. military, but they used to be. Now they're retired and they're looking for other jobs and making a living, okay? About 100 of them were hired out there as a mercenary army, a small army. Now, the Fruit Farmer Coalition that put this little mercenary army together, they wouldn't be able to fight a big country like Great Britain or Germany or Russia or Japan, which was a big up and coming power out in the Pacific. But Hawaii is a small nation with a very small population, and they don't really have any weapons. They don't have any munitions plants. They don't manufacture machine guns and rifles and that kind of stuff. So the Hawaiian people are pretty defenseless when it comes to like an actual like modern conflict with guns and everything. So this small little mercenary army of roughly around 100 guys is able to take over the 7 Hawaiian islands and kind of hold it hostage. So with that, like, it's a weird situation. Now you have these fruit farmers that control Hawaii, but they don't really want to be an independent country. It wasn't like they wanted to make Sanford Dole their new king. He's just a businessman. He's just a fruit farmer that wants to make money. And that was the same story for the rest of these fruit farmers. But they also realize they're in a very precarious situation because they only have 100 soldiers and a few guns. Say Japan or Great Britain, 2 other big naval powers back at that time. If the Japanese Navy or the British Navy just happened to roll up into Pearl Harbor and said, hey, this looks pretty good, and this is a nice little base we got here, I think we're going to take it. That small army of 100 mercenaries couldn't have done anything to like really stop another big major power in the world from coming in there. So they realize how vulnerable they are. So they send a letter and they petition Congress and they say, hey, United States, you had been using Pearl Harbor for a long time. You were really bummed out that the Queen had kicked you out of there. How about you guys come and you annex Hawaii? You take it. We don't want to run the island. You take it as a U.S. territory. You can have your naval base back. Of course, it's yours now. It's your territory. The only thing we ask is that you just let us keep our farms and keep growing our pineapples so that we can keep making money and keep our businesses going. Congress debates that. It's a very controversial thing because we know what happened. That basically there was an autonomous queen there and she got overthrown by these mercenaries and fruit farmers. And I don't know, is that right? Do we want American civilians, these American citizens going to other places in the world, causing revolutions and then turning the land over to us? So we debate it. A lot of congressmen are dead set against it and say that this is immoral and unethical. There's no way we should do this. But a lot of other congressmen say, you know what? Pearl Harbor was a great naval base, and we do kind of want that back. And Hawaii looks beautiful. Maybe that would be a great place that we could add on. And we want to be tough like the other countries, around the world, the other big empires. And we need fueling stations for our Navy. So after a debate that goes on for a few months, they end up voting and saying, yeah, we'll take it. We're going to annex Hawaii. So the fruit farmers just go back to being fruit farmers. The mercenary army just goes back home to America and looks for, other jobs to do. And now Hawaii is officially a U.S. territory. All right. So that's the story of how we got Hawaii. Next up for you. Oh, went too far back. Here, to give you an image, follow my cursor around. Over here, you have the United States. Here's California, right? Over here is Asia. Here's like Japan. The Pacific Ocean is huge. It's the biggest ocean in the world. For how ships were back at this time, if you were going all the way across the Pacific and back, you'd need to refuel at some point. So America, we're looking for bases. Remember, we have the second biggest Navy in the world. Now we have kind of permanently have Hawaii. So the Hawaiian Islands are right there. All right. That's our central base of operations. It's a little bit closer to America than it is to Asia out in the Pacific Ocean. We've also picked up Midway Island. And then with the notes I'm giving you tomorrow, I'm going to explain how we pick up the Philippines and Guam as well. So like after that all plays out, and this all happens roughly around the same time, now we have bases all the way across the Pacific. So we're pretty well set up for our fueling stations. All right, next up, the Queen of Hawaii. Her name is Liliuokalani. Might not be pronouncing that right. There's a picture of her. She was outraged by this. Now, I guess one of the nicer parts of the story, a decent thing, they didn't chop the queen's head off. They didn't kill her or, do anything like that. And to my knowledge, the Hawaiian people weren't like horribly brutalized or murdered or anything like that. It was really just about business. These businessmen wanted to protect their business interests and they didn't like what the queen was doing. So they told her, you got to go. So they had locked her up for a while, but then after it's annexed by the United States, they let her out. And then I guess she comes to the United States. She, for the rest of her life, tries to petition Congress and says, hey, what you guys did was wrong. You should give me the islands back. Hawaii should be an independent country. And Congress kind of said, I don't know about that. They just basically ignored her. The end of her story is kind of sad. I guess I believe she was out riding horses or something and got pneumonia when she was in her late 20s. So she didn't live a very long life, but that ended up taking her out. And remember, the way medicine was back then, nothing like it is today. So like the flu is the number one killer of people back at that time. Here is the most awesome beard I may have ever seen, but I just wanted to give you one more image right there. That is Sanford Dole himself, the guy that was the pineapple farmer that kind of organized the revolution and then petitioned Congress to get Hawaii annexed to the United States. All right. Hopefully that all made sense to you. Add this stuff to your America Becoming a World Power notes, and we will have a quiz in the near future. So any notes you took should serve you well.